We often reach for simple explanations. When confronted with complex human behavior, we say, it must be love that hurts. Or, he's just a jealous person. Or perhaps, she's always been overly sensitive. These explanations are convenient. They reduce what is structurally complex into something psychologically. Digestible, personality, emotion, temperament. But convenience has a cost. The moment we compress a phenomenon into a label, we lose sight of the system that produced it. And that is precisely why this lecture exists. This is not a talk merely for those labeled as pathologically jealous, nor is it solely for those who see themselves as victims of such individuals. Instead, what we are undertaking here is a form of intellectual discipline, a philosophical inquiry into three interrelated transformations. How anxiety within a relationship mutates into power. How love as a concept becomes corrupted into control. And how the human tendency to anchor one's existence in another person inevitably gives rise to tragedy. Most of us live within relationships. We date, we marry, we share our lives. And almost everyone at some point has felt the quiet, unsettling fear. What if I am abandoned? Let us be precise. The problem is not the presence of anxiety. Anxiety is an existential constant. The problem begins when that anxiety is not metabolized internally, but instead externalized, managed through the control of another human being. This is the birthplace of pathological jealousy. So this lecture is not about condemning individuals. It is about mapping a structure that reveals how far a human being can collapse when anxiety is mishandled. If you follow this argument to its conclusion, you will no longer ask, why is that person acting this way? Instead, you will begin to ask far more dangerous and far more truthful questions. At what point does anxiety become power? Where is the boundary at which love transforms into possession? And am I, or someone I love, placing my very existence on top of another person's freedom? These are not questions for a pathological minority. They're questions for anyone who has ever entered a relationship. There is an ancient text that offers a striking insight into the nature of fear. It suggests that fear does not originate from the external world, but from the mind that clings. This insight is not limited to death or metaphysical states. It applies directly to relationships, to love, and to separation. Consider how we behave. We hold on to people to feel secure. We demand reassurance to feel stable. We impose control, believing we are protecting love. But the reality is inverted. The more we cling, the more anxiety intensifies. The more we seek confirmation, the more suspicion grows. The more we attempt to control, the more the relationship disintegrates. Why is this lecture necessary? Because pathological jealousy is not a rare disorder, nor is it an eccentric personality trait. It is, in fact, one of the most dangerous survival strategies, adopted by individuals who never learned how to regulate their own anxiety. And crucially, this strategy does not remain confined to the individual. It spreads into the partner, the family, the children, and eventually into the broader social fabric. This is why we can no longer afford to dismiss it as private jealousy. We must reframe it, not as a moral failing, but as an ontological crisis, not as a personality issue, but as a structural failure, not as a problem of love, but as a symptom of ego destabilization. Let me state this clearly. Pathological jealousy is not about love. It is about existential insecurity. At first glance, it appears to be distrust directed toward another person, a partner, a spouse. But clinically speaking, the core is not distrust of the other. It is distrust of the self. Beneath the surface, three questions operate continuously. Am I fundamentally worthy? Am I someone who can avoid abandonment? Am I replaceable at any given moment? When these questions lack stable answers, the individual collapses not inwardly, but relationally. You may notice a paradox often observed in real life. Those who are themselves unfaithful are frequently the most suspicious of their partners. This is not mere hypocrisy. It is a well-documented psychological mechanism known as projection, the act of attributing one's own impulses, fears, and capacities onto another. In other words, the individual is not truly suspecting the partner. They are confronting their own instability, reflected outward. Now, where does this structure originate? Often it can be traced back to formative environments. Homes where love was inconsistent. Systems where affection was. Conditional granted for success, withdrawn upon failure. Environments saturated with comparison, surveillance, and control. From such conditions, a child learns a fundamental equation. Love is unstable, and therefore it must be constantly verified. This unresolved anxiety does not disappear with age. It migrates into adult relationships where it eventually erupts. For a securely attached individual, relationships have a baseline of safety. For the pathologically jealous individual, the baseline is threat. A delayed message becomes betrayal. A casual conversation becomes danger. An expression of independence becomes a signal of abandonment. Such individuals do not participate in relationships. They attempt to secure them by holding the other in place. At its philosophical core, this is an error of existential positioning. When a person anchors their sense of self in another human being, the loss of that person becomes equivalent to the loss of self. From that point forward, control is no longer optional, it becomes necessary. And control, when insufficient, escalates. First, there is suspicion, then interrogation, then regulation of behavior, and eventually punishment. This progression is not accidental. It is structural, because control does not resolve anxiety. It reinforces it. Each temporary relief teaches the mind that control is effective, thereby demanding stronger control the next time. What remains, in the end, is not love, but domination. And paradoxically, the individual becomes more anxious than ever because they are attempting to sustain a relationship through methods that inherently destroy it. So let us conclude this segment with a critical distinction. Love does not reduce the freedom of the other. Love does not require constant proof. Pathological jealousy is not an excess of love. It is the outsourcing of one's existential instability onto another human being. If this distinction is not understood, relationships do not simply suffer. They collapse into systems of surveillance, coercion, and ultimately, violence. In the next lecture, we will examine how this structure inevitably escalates, how control transforms into aggression, and why the sphere of suspicion expands beyond the partner into the entire social world. If this inquiry has sharpened your perception even slightly, then continuing this exploration is not merely intellectual, it is protective, because to understand structure is to see reality before it becomes irreversible. In the previous segment, we arrived at a critical conclusion. What appears to be love can, under the pressure of unmanaged anxiety, mutate into a system of control. But if we follow this structure to its logical endpoint, we encounter something even more unsettling. Control, when it fails to stabilize the self, does not simply intensify, it evolves. And it evolves in a very specific direction. At a certain stage, the individual no longer relies on personal emotion to justify their behavior. Instead, something far more powerful is invoked: authority, religion, morality, tradition, justice, common sense. Even the vague but forceful phrase. This is what a decent human being should do. At this point, the dynamic shifts fundamentally. What began as a personal anxiety is no longer presented as my fear. It is reframed as your failure, a violation of some higher, unquestionable standard. Why does this transformation occur? Because personal emotion has reached its limit. In the early stages, the individual may say, I feel anxious. But over time, something becomes clear. No amount of checking reduces the anxiety. No amount of control eliminates it. And no amount of compliance from the partner creates lasting stability. Eventually, the individual can no longer persuade themselves using their own feelings. And so they borrow certainty from absolute systems. They begin to say things like, this is wrong, even from a religious standpoint. In a normal family, this would never be acceptable. This goes against basic human decency. If you had any conscience, notice what has happened. The conversation is no longer about their anxiety. It is now about your morality. Philosophically, this is one of the most dangerous shifts a human mind can make, when attachment disguises itself as truth. At that moment, self-doubt disappears. The internal structure becomes rigid. I am right. You are wrong. And I am justified in correcting you. Once this framework is established, something profound occurs. Control is no longer perceived as control. It becomes duty. And when duty enters the equation, even aggression can be reinterpreted as righteousness. This is why the fusion of pathological jealousy with systems of belief, particularly religion, can be so volatile. Because religion provides a ready-made language of moral absolutism. You must resist temptation. You must remain pure. You are being tested. This is the work of evil. With this vocabulary, ordinary human interactions, casual conversations, friendships, independence can be instantly recast as moral failure. And the individual, convinced of their own righteousness, no longer experiences their anger as emotion. They experience it as justice. They will say, I'm not angry. I'm correcting what is wrong. I'm teaching responsibility. This is not the absence of aggression. It is aggression, refined and legitimized. From a psychological standpoint, this is among the most resistant structures to change, because the individual does not perceive themselves as the problem. They perceive themselves as the solution. Now consider the position of the person on the receiving end of this dynamic. Gradually, they are no longer treated as a partner, but as a subject under evaluation. They must explain. They must justify. They must repent. They must promise. And yet, no matter how sincerely they comply, the standard continues to shift. Why? Because the purpose of the standard was never order. It was anxiety regulation. At this point, we must draw a critical distinction. There is a difference between someone who lives by moral principles and someone who weaponizes them. True morality disciplines the self. Weaponized morality dominates others. When jealousy reaches this stage, the relationship has already entered a high-risk zone. But the structure does not stop here. Let us move to an even more difficult question. Why does such a person almost never leave the relationship on their own? And why is the moment of separation the most dangerous? Many people, observing from the outside, ask a seemingly reasonable question. If they are so unhappy, why don't they just walk away? The answer is simple, but deeply unsettling. Because for this individual, the relationship is not about love. It is about survival. In a healthy relationship, a partner is someone with whom we share emotional exchange. But for the pathologically jealous individual, the partner serves a radically different function. They are an external structure that stabilizes the self. They validate worth. They regulate anxiety. They confirm existence. Remove that structure, and the individual does not experience loss. They experience collapse. This is why they cannot simply walk away. If the relationship must end, it can only end in one way, by transforming the other person into the cause of the collapse. You made me this way. You crossed the line. I endured as long as I could. This narrative is essential. Without it, the individual would be forced to confront abandonment, and with it, their own instability. Now consider the inverse scenario, when the other person attempts to leave. At that precise moment, the internal equation shifts rapidly. Control is failing. Identity is destabilizing. Annihilation feels imminent. And in the face of that fear, something critical disappears. Not morality, not logic, but restraint. What remains is pure survival instinct. You will often observe a predictable pattern of responses. Sudden emotional collapse, tears, pleading, promises of total transformation, implicit or explicit threats of self-harm. Statements like, "Without you, I'm nothing." Rapid attempts to mobilize external allies. These behaviors can appear sincere, and in a limited sense, they are. But their function is not transformation. It is preservation of the relationship structure. And when preservation through control fails, another mechanism emerges. Fear, threats, intimidation, reputation damage, isolation tactics, even physical coercion. This is not an escalation of love. It is the final reflex of a collapsing system. So let us be unequivocal. Ending such a relationship is not merely an emotional decision. It is a matter of safety. It requires planning. It requires support. It requires clarity. Because what is at stake is not just the relationship, but the integrity of the self. And yet, despite all of this, there is one question that continues to trouble observers. Why do people return? Why, after experiencing control, fear, even harm, do they go back? The answer is not weakness. It is design. At the moment of rupture, the individual, who once controlled and dominated, often undergoes a dramatic transformation. They become fragile. They become remorseful. They become dependent. They say, "I was just afraid. I've been hurt before. You're the only one who understands me." And in that moment, the entire relational frame inverts. The aggressor becomes the victim. The victim becomes the rescuer. This is one of the most sophisticated psychological traps in human relationships, because it activates something deeply human, compassion. But there is a critical distinction that must be understood. Compassion that grants freedom is genuine. Compassion that binds you to suffering is no longer compassion, it is attachment. When someone returns under these conditions, the system does not reset. It reinforces itself. The controlling individual interprets the return as confirmation. Control works. Dependence is real. Escalation is justified. And so the cycle repeats. Anxiety, suspicion, control, aggression, remorse, reunion, again and again until something breaks. So we arrive at a final, uncomfortable truth. Not every relationship can be healed through love. Not every person can be changed through patience. Because what we are dealing with here is not a symptom. It is a structure. A structure that sustains itself through control, justification, and the illusion of righteousness. In the next lecture, we will go further. We will examine why this structure inevitably expands, why suspicion spreads beyond the partner, to friends, family, even strangers. And perhaps most critically, we will ask, how does the individual who enacts this system eventually come to see themselves as the victim? And why do others so often believe them? This inquiry may become more uncomfortable, but discomfort in this context is not the danger. Blindness is. If this perspective has sharpened your awareness even slightly, then continuing this exploration is not simply intellectual engagement. It is an act of self-preservation, because understanding the structure is the first step toward refusing to be consumed by it.